Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome back to the table Raul Grijalva, Democrat of Arizona, represents the 3rd District, co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, and also sits on many different caucuses dealing with immigration issues. But before we go there, sir, I want to get your reaction to what happened in Boston yesterday.
It was a paralyzing moment, the terror. And as the president said, let's not jump to conclusions as to who, what, and the motivation, but the fact that I think also the White House admitted they are acts of terror. And so it's a paralyzing moment for Americans, the backdrop to all the discussions we're having here in Washington, in Congress, whether it's gun violence, immigration reform, the budget, what to do next. Then you have this horrific backdrop of that kind of points out the vulnerabilities of our nation. And in a free society, those ongoing vulnerabilities. I think for all of us, it's a moment that just brings so many other memories to light. But more importantly, I think it kind of makes one understand that in this great free society of ours, we always have to be not only alert, but very protective of each other in our country.
How did you find out?
There's a system that alerts members of Congress as to any incident that is viewed as threatening, and any incident of this magnitude, obviously we're alerted, our staffs are alerted, but at the same time it was, with communications the way they are now, it's instantaneous, and all of us were kind of glued to television sets and following that whole tragedy.
Who alerts you, and is it on your...
I think it's Capitol Police, and it's on our communications, on our phones, on our iPads, and I think all members receive that kind of alert on any occasion. If there is something that appears to be suspicious around the Capitol, we're alerted to that as well.
Will you be receiving a briefing by the Capitol Police today? What have you been told?
I haven't received any notice of that, but usually if there is going to be any increased security, any additional protections, restrictions of movement for members or their staffs, we're told about that and briefed.
And you haven't been told that?
We have not received any of that kind of information at this point.
This has been called by one White House official, quoted in most of the papers, if not all of them today, appears to be an act of terror and will be treated as such. What do you make of that?
Well, the sequence and the of the explosions, I think that's the obvious conclusion that people have reached, and I think it's an accurate one. This was meant to hurt, to render as much violence, and to have the kind of shock that it's having across the country, and certainly for the poor victims that were there. I think the aggressiveness of the White House response is an appropriate one. We have to get to that, and as the president said, the full measure of justice. The consequence of an act like this should be the immediate consequence of finding out who, and the application of the full measure of justice, and the president's correct on that.
Is security adequate?
I believe it is. I believe that you can do other things. One can have many things in place, but as I think many commentators have stated today, in a free and open society, with the liberties and the freedom movement that we enjoy as Americans, that is a restriction, and privacy restrictions. Those issues that we debate constantly in Congress are still very sacred and very important.
Daryl Rich tweets in this to you, sir. Not that it makes things better in Boston, but Iraq lost 55 people to bombs yesterday. Is this where the United States is headed?
I would hope not. I really believe that we as a nation, is that agony that we see in Iraq, in the Middle East, in Syria, is that going to now come to our shores? That's a question many people are asking themselves today. I don't believe it is, and I say that with hope and expectation that it doesn't, but our vigilance and our ability to deter that is going to be tested in the next few months, absolutely.
Do you think what happened yesterday in Boston has an impact on key legislation like immigration reform and gun control, the debates about the timing of them, having them, etc.?
It shouldn't. It shouldn't. It's a horrible backdrop. And I agree with the senators, the 8 senators that said we're going to delay the official announcement for a later date. But that very sober, complex, and troubling issue for the nation of immigration reform deserves the seriousness of this country. Same thing with gun violence. That very important and issue deserves the attention of Congress. This horrific act today deserves the attention of Congress, but we are hit because of our democracy, and I think part of the shock shouldn't be that we cease business as a country trying to solve our problems under the threat of terror. The thing to do is to proceed as a democracy and continue to do our work.
The Gang of 8 in the Senate has said they'll postpone their news conference to another day. The hearing has been postponed as well to the end of the week, but they have released the proposal. The Washington Post front page this morning on the details of that. Billions of dollars would be invested in new border control measures, including surveillance drones, security fencing, and 3,500 additional federal agents charged with apprehending people attempting to enter illegally from Mexico. As a person who represents a border state, what do you think this would do?
I don't know if, and I'll be honest, I don't know if that gesture of an additional $3 billion, 3,500 additional Border Patrol agents, drones, additional fencing, technological requests that are part of that, is going to make the issue of border security 100% zero variable.
Why
think
not? Why not?
We're spending $19 billion a year. Homeland Security is the largest federal law enforcement department in the country. I think it's incumbent on any piece of legislation that has enforcement and security as a central part of it, and this does. And many of us understand that it was going to be part of it in order to deal with something comprehensively. I think that we need to do on that security issue oversight. We need to audit how money has been used. We need to revisit that mission as to what its application is. And we need to have a uniformity of policy for Border Patrol agents, due process for citizens and others that feel they've been aggrieved as a consequence of the application of that enforcement, and transparency. With an agency this large, with a commitment of billions upon billions of dollars, I think transparency and oversight need to go part and parcel with any initiative to increase border security. Otherwise, we're putting money on top of money, and the complaints will continue to persist that it's not enough. Let's look at what we're doing now, audit its effectiveness, and more importantly, add transparency and due process to that situation, which we don't have now.
You note $19 billion a year on border security. Here is USA Today on the Gang of Eight's proposal. The bill seeks $7 billion for border security. Why can't the efficacy of border security be tracked? Why can't you know whether or not the border is secure?
And the frustration in your voice is the frustration all of us, particularly on the border. We keep increasing the militarization of that border. It begins to affect economies in that area, and the region certainly affects it in the district I represent. And yet there is always a persistent demand for more. And the persistent demand usually comes from Washington. You don't hear it from the border communities themselves that they want more. Some of those communities, Nogales, El Paso, that are on the border are the safest cities, one of the safest cities in the country. But the fact remains that if we are going to make security the linchpin, and we're going to put dollars on top of dollars, taxpayer money, and there is a lack of transparency and oversight, I'm not sure that this doesn't become just another symbolic gesture, and the outcome continues to be one that is in doubt, and people keep demanding more.
For yourself, representing a border state, as co-chairman of the Progressive Caucus, if any legislation that comes to be in the House and the Senate includes border security, as you say, as the linchpin to a pathway to citizenship. The border has to be secure before these 11 million can get on a pathway to citizenship. If that's the case, are you a yes vote?
No, I think the triggers is arbitrary triggers. It shouldn't be part of this legislation. It's my understanding that there'd be a period of 3 to 5 years to look at how those initiatives are working, and then if they're not meeting some benchmark, then you look at forming a commission that would then come in and restructure what that mission is. That's a halfway point that I'm not comfortable with, but in a process of compromise and trying to reach what many of us believe is what I advocate for, is that pathway and family unification. In this whole process, as I've stated over and over again, there's some pills that need to be swallowed that are not very, very comfortable for me and other members of Congress. A security myopic look at how we do immigration reform is not the way to go. But the linchpin for me has been a path. If that is a trade-off,
You're on board.
Then it's fair. But if
Okay.
there's triggers attached that says we will not move on this path unless, then I'm uncomfortable and not supportive, and I think a lot of other people will be too.
All right, let's get to phone calls here. Jan in Kokomo, Indiana, Democratic. Caller, you up first for the congressman. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Representative. I have 3 quick questions to ask you.
Okay.
My first thing is my grandson and my concern. He's took a job in Arizona, and I begged him not to go because I thought it was an unsafe place. And he went anyway, and he loved it. But I am very frightened for him, and I ask him all the time, "Are you safe? Are you safe?" My second question is, I made phone calls for Hillary Clinton, and when she stood up and said to a man who said he had a wife here illegally, she said, "No one is illegal." That's when I stopped making phone calls for her. And the third question is, why did it come down to 11 million from 20 million, which it used to always be? Thank you very much, and I'll listen to you.
I think the number's always been consistent between 9 to 13 million historically. I think that number of 11 million gets smaller because this package is set on the starting date of the December 31st of 2011. You have to have been in the country on that date or prior to that date, and so that's going to affect maybe 600, 700,000 other folk that have arrived since that December 31st, 2011 date. That number's been around and been consistent for a long, long time. And the other point is your whole point about making calls for Hillary. You know, what are the interesting studies that came? And we have to accept this very, very important issue. That's why the pathway to citizenship and the issue of family unification is so critical. A study recently done on migration, the majority of people that are caught re-entering the country after they were deported are coming back because they have a blended family. They have a spouse, children that are citizens here, live in this country, and that we have a divided family. So this is not a question of a habitual criminal act. It's a question of people wanting to be with their families, which is a very, very necessary instinct. Arizona continues to be a very decent and safe state, and I'm glad that your son, I think, is enjoying his stay there, and I hope he remains there and makes it home. A lot of people have. A lot of what happened with Arizona is more to do with reputation than with danger. When you had a governor running around saying that they found heads in the desert, which turned out to be completely false and made up, yeah, that goes national. When you have a sheriff that conducts raids, that goes national. When you have the constant drumbeat, this is a threat, it is dangerous, you send out that perception. And I think the worst public relations job that has ever been done for the state of Arizona was the laws that it passed that turned many people against that state, and the hype, political hype by our governor and other elected officials that have tried to lay the impression that Arizona is a cauldron of violence, death and destruction. The reality is it's a southwestern state, diverse, healthy, and with all the challenges that every other state has when it comes to violence.
Still an individual on Twitter tweets in this: Coburn had an idea. Green cards leading to citizenship and red cards only allow it for crossing back and forth for work. Why so complicated?
Well, I think the pathway issue of getting the work visa, I think what the Senate bill has is minimum is a 13-year wait, potentially more. I think we've overcomplicated that issue, but that's been part of the compromise process through this whole thing. The other thing was that the guest worker program, where I'm glad that there was finally a decision made, not only with organized labor in the chamber, but with farm workers and growers in the Southwest, in that you don't want indentured servitude in this country. You don't want a second-class set of workers in this country that get less than everybody else in terms of wage, and then continue to drive wages around us down. And I think that protection that was orchestrated by organized labor and the United Farm Workers is a good protection, not only for the people that work in those areas and for guest workers, but more importantly for workers in general in this country.
And here from the New York Times, it says this: in order to apply for permanent residence visas known as green cards, after 10 years, illegal immigrants would have to pay an approximate $2,000 penalty fee, including $500 up front. They must also demonstrate knowledge of English and civics and have worked regularly and maintain a continuous physical presence in the country.
Yeah, and you know, I think people have to understand that this is, anybody that tries to say that this is amnesty, that there's a wand being waved and legal status is granted immediately, is buying a myth that does not exist. This set of immigrants that are being given the opportunity to go on a pathway are going to have to jump through more hoops, wait longer, pay more in order to establish their permanent residency and potentially citizenship in the country. No other set of immigrants has had to go through this, and you know, part of this compromise is also part of the reaction to how divisive this issue has been to this nation. And you see elements of both throughout this proposal by the senators.
In the House, there's a gang of 8 as well working on legislation. When might they release a plan?
I don't know. I would anticipate that it would be shortly after. You know, I'm for one right now working off the template that the Senate has here, and working off and be working with other groups to try to, and other senators to try to modify, try to change some of the areas in which we think it becomes. It's becoming too punitive in some of those areas, particularly doing away with some visa categories entirely. We also think that that the pathway issue needs to be better defined. The security component, what is the criteria, needs to be better defined, and I really believe that there has to be a little more touch of humanity to this whole issue. Right now, we're dealing with numbers and data. I think there's faces there that we have to deal with. I'm going to work off this as the template, because the 4 colleagues from our side of the aisle that are working on it, I admire very much and admire everything they're doing in this effort. But there is a more resistant strain in the House when it comes to immigration reform, very hard line on it, and I think if the House produces something, I don't think it'll be any better than the Senate bill, with the potential, I predict, of being worse.
National Journal reporting that the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Bob Goodlatte of Virginia, forget working groups is their headline, House Judiciary moving immigration on its own.
That's exactly it, and I think one of the points that you'll see in the House is to delay it as much as possible, and to try to do it piecemeal, which I think defeats the whole purpose of a reform package that's comprehensive.
Chris, Chester, South Carolina, independent caller. Hi, Chris.
Hey, the one article where you put down about the $2,000 coming in, that they only have to pay $500 up front and then get a long time to pay the rest, is garbage, because what this is, I mean, if I owe $2,000 to you guys on my income taxes, do you guys sit there and go, oh, well, here, you can pay off a little bit at a time and then pay the rest off over a long time without being penalized? That's garbage.
Congressman?
There's a provision, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that if there are back taxes due of the people that beyond the $2,000, that is the fee that is being required in order to help pay for the processing of individuals, that'll also be demanded as well. It's a two-sided sword here to the gentleman that called. Many of these undocumented workers that have been working in various industries in this country pay into a great deal of federal taxes, whether it's deducted from their payroll for Social Security, for FICA, etc., with no opportunity of ever retrieving or utilizing that tax because they're prohibited from taking any federal programs. Also, I think one of the areas in which there will be some consternation is the fact that even though they have a work visa and working toward a permanent status, that all public benefits will be denied to the 11 million people that qualify for this program.
Joe Meehan on Twitter, why would a penalty be universal? Some here illegally use more services and some break more laws.
Yeah, and part of the criteria is going to be exactly that, your background, criminal and otherwise, and hopefully this process is going to begin to dispel another myth that is used incessantly to try to stop immigration reform, is that that you have people here that are just taking from the federal government and from the rest of the taxpayers. That is a myth, and and regardless of the studies and regardless of the scientific backing to say it's a myth, it continues to perpetuate as a myth.
So part of a pathway to citizenship would be a criminal background check?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It's always been part of that.
Mike, Miamisburg, Ohio, Republican caller.
Yes, I'd just like to say all the people that are here illegally should be deported because they've already committed a crime by being here. And I know they consider that as a misdemeanor, but it's like they say, when you smoke marijuana, you'll end up on heroin. So I'm just saying that if they're backed into a corner, they're going to commit more crimes just to be here.
Okay. Congressman?
I don't make that correlation that an undocumented person by nature is going to continue to is a criminal. I reject that. But you know I think that's an interesting point there. That you know the whole self-deportation, mass deportation, everybody's conceded that idea borders on lunacy, and it'll be destructive to our economy and to the whole social fiber. I mentioned blended families. There are over 5 million children where one or the other of their parents is undocumented that are citizens. There are in 5,100 kids right now in foster care, that are now foster children whose parents have been deported. That reality will not disappear. And so to pretend that reality is not part of it. Part of immigration reform and this whole discussion is about reality. And if we continue to pretend that we can have surface discussions and not deal with the reality and make this just the same politically divisive fight that we've had for the last 6 elections with no conclusion at the end, it's not only we're dealing with the undocumented, but we're dealing about the whole social fabric of this nation that's at risk as well.
Edwin Christian on Twitter, with the proposals, I see no incentive for the immigrants to come out of the shadows.
That has been a concern. The cost, okay, the length of time, and the pressure to come forward. I think we have to look. That's why I say we need a human discussion about this. What's an incentive and a disincentive? But in my office, in the district, every day you deal with families that are divided. You deal with a sense of desperation, people in the shadows. And I think the impulse of many of the immigrants that we're talking about with this legislation, the impulse, regardless of the hoops they have to jump through, regardless of the weight they have to go through, I think the instinct will be to come out and for their own self-protection, but more importantly, for the protection of their families.
So you think the majority of these 11 million will?
The desperation is such that that's the incentive.
Okay. From the Wall Street Journal this morning about that, Homeland Security Secretary would have to submit within 180 days of a $4.5 billion plan for surveillance systems, fences, drones, etc., that they have effective control of the border, meaning at least 90% of people attempting to enter illegally are apprehended or turned back. At that point, the Wall Street Journal goes on to say, illegal immigrants could register for provisional legal status, allowing those who have lived in the U.S. since December 31st, 2011, to work for any employer and travel outside the U.S., but not be eligible for federal benefit programs. Clifford in Jacksonville, Florida, Democratic caller. Thanks for waiting, Clifford. You're on the air with Congressman Grijalva. Go ahead.
Good morning. Shalom, Congressman. My question is this right here. Why do y'all in Congress allow outside groups? Now, I'm not trying to come with no racial overtone or nothing like this, but y'all allow outside groups to dictate whether or not y'all pass effective laws helping this situation. Everybody in this country is an illegal alien. All right, at one point in time, you used to walk across the border, no problem. Now it's a problem because of race, and it's because of racism that done infiltrated not only mainland society, but the White House and the Congress itself. If everybody was to just get on one accord, we all are human beings. We all are people. We all are children of God. There's no immigrant. There's no black, there's no white, this is just a human race.
All right, we'll get a response from the Congressman.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. You know, throughout the discussion on immigration, lying very thinly under the surface has been the corresponding discussion of race, the corresponding discussion of diversity, culture, languages. How many times have I heard, you know, this is not the America I know. This is a different America, and it is a different America, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The diversity of this nation has been its strength. This nation built on immigrants. I'm a first-generation American, and I would put my merits as an American up against anybody. And I think that's the legacy of this nation, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. But there's no question that underlining this debate has been the very sinister issue of race, and part of the resistance to immigration reform has, unfortunately, in some sectors, been based solely on that.
Gary, Ashland, Ohio, independent caller. Last phone call here for the Congressman. Go ahead.
I'd like to know what the cost of the illegals are to the United States, and what the cost of legal immigrants are, and what if they're given amnesty and or a guest worker program, how much will all that cost the taxpayers?
Okay, Gary, since we're running out of time, I'll leave it there and have the Congressman respond.
I think that the additional cost is mostly in security. Much of the processing is going to be...
I think he was asking about currently. How much does it cost now? Do we know?
I don't think that that's a figure that... I think it's on the plus side for the American taxpayer, because undocumented people here that are working are paying into the federal revenue with no ability to get return, number one. Number two, I think that many times it's been a benefit for business in the sense that they were able to pay less than they would pay someone else.
Well, that's a question from R. Harrington on Twitter. Real quick, how will employers be monitored to follow E-Verify, and is this an extra expense for the employers?
I think there's going to be an implementation period. I think the E-Verify has got to verify. There was too many problems with it the last time. And I think that's incumbent on the federal government to make that assurances to businesses, that the database is up to date, that the registration is up to date, and then you can start talking about what the disincentives are going to be for business if they do indeed hire someone that is not documented.
Congressman Raul Grijalva, Democrat of Arizona, Progressive Caucus co-chairman, thank you very much for coming back on the Washington Journal. I appreciate it. We're going to continue our conversation about the key issues in Congress, as well as what happened in Boston yesterday with those 2 explosions. Luke Messer will be joining us, a Republican of Indiana. And then later, we'll turn our attention solely to the bombings in Boston yesterday with Steve Emerson, Executive Director of the Investigative Project on Terrorism. But first, a news update from C-SPAN Radio.